Welcome to the Honorable Minister of Justice, members of the media, radio listeners via St. Martin Radio 107.9 FM, respective radio stations island-wide, Tel TV Plus Channel 15, and online viewers. I'm Rolika Roach, and welcome to the live Council of Ministers press briefing for today, Wednesday, June 25th, 2025. At this time, I would like to invite the Honorable Minister of Justice, Natalie Tacklin, to address you. Minister Tacklin, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Rolika. Good morning to the members of the media and, of course, to the people of St. Martin. I want to begin today by acknowledging my recent absence during the budget debate in Parliament. While, of course, I would have preferred to be present in person, I am pleased, however, that the 2025 budget has been approved. That gives us the necessary tools to continue doing the work the people of St. Martin rightfully expect of us. I also extend my gratitude to my dedicated team within the Ministry of Justice who worked closely with me during my absence to ensure accurate responses were provided in a timely manner to aid parliamentary discussions. I have to say it was also quite exhausting during my trip because, of course, we stayed up the whole time trying to ensure that all the answers were accurate, a lot of times answering them ourselves. So there were late nights for me, especially with the time difference during the CC in Europe. But nevertheless, I think we ensured that that the answers were accurate. And for my staff that didn't travel with me, you know, I'm grateful for them for burning the midnight oil here with, of course, the acting Minister of Justice, the Minister of Finance. I know it was a tough time for her. So I also want to take the opportunity here to thank her as well. So that being said, over the past several weeks, I've had the opportunity to represent St. Martin on several important work visits. All of these were aimed at advancing justice sector reform, deepening our cooperation, and securing long-term support for our institutions. I want to briefly share the impact of each of these trips that I took. The first one was actually in the last week of May. On May 26th, I had traveled to Trinidad to participate in the 60th plenary of the CFATF, which is the Caribbean Financial Action Task Force. This is where our country's progress in combating money laundering, terrorism financing, and related financial crimes was assessed. The CFATF led St. Martin through a major evaluation. It was our current fourth round evaluation, which is a rigorous assessment of how well our country detects, prevents, and combats financial crimes and terrorism financing. This evaluation covered the period of 2019 to 2023 and measured both our technical compliance and our effectiveness, because it's not just about having the legislation in place, it's also about having the tools to actually be able to act on different things. You know, can we actually detect signals? And when we do detect them, do we have the proper mechanisms in place to be able to handle that? The evaluation showed improvement in several areas, but it also made clear that we still have a lot of work ahead of us. Our next report is therefore due in May 2026, so we will have to go back to the plenary once more. But in the meantime, we will be rolling out targeted actions to strengthen supervisory bodies, align strategies within the kingdom and our regional partners, and of course, advance our national risk-based action plan. One thing that I made clear at the plenary in Trinidad was that St. Martin was not there to make excuses. We were there to reflect, we were there to improve, and we're there to act. Financial crime is not just a technical issue, it's about trust, safety, and opportunity for our people. So in the coming weeks, months, and of course, up until the next plenary, you know, we will be working actively on this. It was very helpful for me to be there in person because there was so much you learn within that week and seeing how other countries are addressing these issues, and also have the opportunity to speak to that assessment team to really talk about the technicalities to see where St. Martin can improve and how we can really strengthen this system. And I know to a lot of folks, it might seem sometimes, and this is one of the things where, as a Ministry of Justice, we operate on a level of international compliance as well and international obligations, because the way that we score in these tests affect the way that we're able to bank, affect the way, whether or not we can take money out of the ATM. So while it may seem as something kind of high level, it's very important to the day-to-day life of people here in St. Martin, and it's why it's important for me as Minister of Justice to attend and also to ensure that we remain compliant and that we remain effective more than anything else. Then from June 10th to 12th, I traveled to Strasbourg. The days prior to Strasbourg, of course, I was in the Netherlands, and I had combined that with work visits. I got the opportunity to speak with on a high level there about different types of programs. There were some press releases that went out to that effect. But I wanted to maybe just spend a little more time now talking about the trip to Strasbourg. At that trip, I addressed the 46 member states at the Committee of Ministers for the Council of Europe. That is a section of actually the European Court of Human Rights. So as many people may remember, there was in 2018 a judgment that was rendered against the Kingdom of the Netherlands, the Corallo case, and that was an important human rights matter concerning, of course, the detention conditions here in St. Martin. As a result of that, of course, the Kingdom, then has to give follow-up to the recommendations made by the European Court of Human Rights. As a result of that, we've been in what we call an enhanced follow-up procedure. And as part of that enhanced follow-up, we're actually obligated to every 3 to 6 months actually provide updates to the Council of Europe in writing. And then every so often, the case is then heard and discussed with the Committee of Ministers with all 46 member states. This was actually the first time that the Minister of Justice of St. Martin, during the course of this court case, attended in person. Previously, the ministers had attended virtually. I did recognize that I said if I had $1 for every time someone at the Council of Europe told me how grateful they were that a minister was there in person, that I could have had a lot of money for our justice budget and maybe hired some more police officers or fixed the detention conditions at an even more rapid pace. But that being said, over there, I reaffirmed our commitment to compliance, not just in word, but in action. I shared updates on the new prison project, our collaboration with the UN, both UNOPS and UNODC, and the restoration of key programs. Of course, a big part of the discussion centered around the fire that had the arson that was committed in the prison about a month ago, just over a month ago. And of course, what we were doing in that time to ensure that we were reestablishing normalcy as much as possible within the prison. More importantly, I also conveyed to the Committee of Ministers that our work is not just about ticking boxes. It's about restoring dignity and institutional trust in the prison itself. During the visit, I also held courtesy visits and in-depth meetings with different bodies of the Council of Europe to see how we can further work together. I met with the Council of Europe's Deputy Secretary General, the CPT, which is the Committee for the Prevention of Torture, the Directorate of Human Rights, the Department for the Execution of Judgments within the Council of Europe, the Vice President of the European Court of Human Rights, and several other executive branches of the Council of Europe. These exchanges, I think, opened many doors for further cooperation. And I also extend my appreciation to the Council of Europe for hosting me and to the Dutch ambassador and the delegates of the Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs for their assistance to me during that trip. St. Martin will continue to uphold its responsibilities under the European Convention on Human Rights, not just out of obligation, but out of conviction, because we believe that this is something that's important. Then last week, I participated in the JVO, which is a 4-country meeting between the 4 ministers of justice within the kingdom. However, at the last minute, the Minister of Justice of the Netherlands had to cancel his trip. His delegation still came, but the minister himself was unable to attend due to, of course, the cabinet crisis in the Netherlands and reallocation of portfolios. And he's now has part of the very famous Asiel dossier, and that required some in-person meetings last week, so he was unable to make it with us. However, the 3 ministers of the other islands and the other countries found it important to still have this meeting take place. Typically, it happens in January and June. In January, we were actually unable to have a JVO because of the elections in Aruba and Curacao, so we found it even more important for us to still meet and discuss important matters. So we held both bilateral and tripartite meetings. So I met separately with the ministers of Justice of Aruba and then with the Minister of Justice of Curacao, but then we also had a tripartite together. During those meetings, we addressed deeper systemic issues that all three of us face: staffing shortages, aging infrastructure within the justice sector, and of course, increasing pressure on all our prison systems. One point that I raised with some urgency is the homicide rate in St. Martin, which remains higher than in our sister islands. And that's true for both the Dutch and French sides of St. Martin. We spoke very frankly about early intervention for at-risk youth, the growing influence of organized crime, and the need for a kingdom-wide community-based strategies. We also reflected on how to make the AVO more impactful. As I shared with my colleagues, we all face similar challenges, so let's work together more strategically and together. So in that vein, when it comes to our youth and youth crime, actually Curacao is taking the lead right now and going to work out a plan of approach, which we will then discuss in our next meeting in January, which is actually being held in St. Martin for the next EAVO. While there, I also had the opportunity to visit Aruba's correctional facility, KIA, and then got to speak to them firsthand about valuable insights, what they apply, how they approach their prison system, and also to compare, the infrastructure of Point Blanche versus what it looks like on some of our sister islands. So that was a very helpful and useful trip. And I also, of course, had the opportunity to, in person, extend my gratitude and appreciation to both Minister Dowers of Aruba and Minister Hato of Curacao for their assistance during the Point Blanche prison crisis. They both assisted St. Martin by, very quickly actually mobilizing guards that we could utilize and that came here. And, I think that's really that perfect example of what cooperation within the kingdom can look like. And it was important to me to be able to meet them in person and not just over the phone. So that was a good opportunity for that as well. Then I'll move on from the trips. And I did want to address the recent media claims that I also came across yesterday while I was in travel, saying that customs officers were engaged in a go-slow. The management team of the Department of Customs has already put out a press release, but as minister, I also wanted to make it absolutely clear that customs remains fully operational. There has been no disruption in service, and I'm not sure where this go-slow came from. It was not mentioned to the ministry. And of course, I was reassured by the customs management team yesterday that the officers continue to carry out their duties with professionalism and that the ministry remains in active dialogue to resolve any long-standing concerns in a sustainable manner that the customs workers may have. So again, no go-slow, no formal communication of a go-slow, and everything remains operational. And again, we are in discussion with all the different departments in justice to address any long-standing concerns and issues that they have. Then, with respect to the prison, we're continue on that path towards stability. We're in what we now are calling our recovery phase. And inmates' housing has returned to normal and visitations have resumed. I'm also pleased to report that recreational and rehabilitation programs are gradually being reinstated. And we're also, I think, what was a nice opportunity here was that we were able to really kind of reignite, no pun intended, our relationship with the probation services, who are also now more active in terms of providing programs and did a Father's Day program with the inmates. And so that's been nice to see as well. And in the broader structure of the prison reconstruction. And as I've continued to say, it's been very important to me that we start our soft component reform now and not when the new facility is there. And that in that vein, we've been in touch with the UNODC, who would be our implementing partner of the soft components. And right now we're in the final phases of formalizing that agreement for them to actually hopefully start within the next month or two. So that would be great because that's also looking at how we can give more programs, more rehabilitation to the inmates right now. I also had an opportunity to speak with a group in Aruba that was actually currently providing programs in KIA, in their correctional facility. Their director is going to be visiting St. Martin in the next 2 weeks. And we have a meeting scheduled with them to see perhaps how they can also assist with deploying similar programs that they have here in the prison. They're able to do a lot using European funding. So I think that that's something very interesting to us, because wherever of course, we can gain from utilizing any types of grants or funding from abroad, that's always a win-win for us. So we have those coming up, and I hope to be able to share some more updates on that front over the coming weeks. Then, of course, the LBAs, there were already some press releases, but just to reinforce that as well, batch 13 has been signed and distributed, and batches 14, 15, and 16 are currently under review. When I say under review, we're busy finalizing that the files are complete. And as we had explained in Parliament, we're using a new structure with the SWAB, doing that validation process to ensure that all the calculations are correct, that you're going through all the different payroll systems, etc. All those files are there, so we're ensuring that everything is complete. And I know that there's been a lot of pressure. We've said that, kind of to be safe, where we're thinking Q4 of this year, that we would have everything complete. I know that people would like to see more structured timelines. I'm hoping that within the next, maybe during this week or the week after, that I can have a stronger indication of exact timelines, because right now it's still kind of making sure all of the information is there. And of course, we're talking about hundreds of files. So right now we're still in discussion with SWAB to get a clear indication on those timelines. So I'm hoping that that is also something that I can communicate with a little more clarity instead of just saying Q4. But I do want to assure everybody that it's the utmost priority that everything is complete within the next few months. So Q4 is actually very soon. So at least that, I think, is at least some type of timeline indication. So then just to be clear, batches 14 and 15 are all remaining justice workers besides the prison. So 14, 15 is anyone who is still outstanding from the Immigration Department, from Customs, from KPSM, etc. Batch 16 is the prison. The whole batch is the prison. It's 95, and that's so just to give an indication of numbers. So 13, 14, 15, and 16, the entire rest of the Justice Ministry, and then of course there's a separate batch that would be just the department heads, because that was already a discussion from before that the department heads would come at the end, from I think a place of solidarity. Yes. Then, finally, not necessarily too justice related, but as we approach the end of June, of course, graduation season is upon us. I tried to make a nail appointment, and they were very busy with prom and graduation and everything else, so I know. So to all the graduates, whether you're in primary school, high school, university, congratulations. You've worked hard, stayed the course, and now you're stepping into your next chapter. As the Minister of Justice, I encourage you to carry your values, your discipline, and your dreams with you. St. Martin needs bright, bold minds, and know that we believe in you. And of course, if you would like to have a career in justice, the Justice Ministry especially believes in you. And we hope that we could create more opportunities, again, for careers within the civil service and within the Justice Ministry. So I've shared a lot today so far. But all these updates, whether they were from Trinidad, from Strasbourg, from the Netherlands, or from Aruba, they're not disconnected events. They're part of a wider strategy to strengthen our institutions, build trust, and secure the support that we need to serve our people better. Each trip was a deliberate step toward reinforcing the justice system in a justice system that our people deserve. One rooted in transparency, accountability, dignity, and resilience. Now that the budget has been approved, we have the means to continue, not just by planning, but delivering on the reforms and improvements our justice system requires. I'll end by encouraging the media and the people of St. Martin to follow our official communication channels for accurate updates and deeper insight into the progress being made within the Ministry of Justice. So then I think now I'm just the only one here for questions too, right?
Thank you, Minister Tacklin. We now move on to the question and answer session of Emil Lee of Island Radio. You have the floor.
Good morning, Minister. And thank you. Very often in the past, when it was just one minister, I would see the Council of Ministers press briefings being canceled. So we recognize that you're here alone and appreciate that. So my first question has to do with road safety license plates. I believe that vehicles by law are required to have 2 license plates on the vehicle, one front, one back, and that those license plates should be clearly visible, not obscured. If you notice on the roads, if you do an unofficial survey, you will see that there are many cars with only one license plate on the back, and very often you'll see the license plates are with a heavy black tint over it. So number one, is that correct? And what's the legal requirement? But the second part to that is what I've heard from reliable sources is that there's a big increase in terms of hit and run accidents. Many vehicles here, people have only third-party insurance. So when they are the victim of a hit and run, so in other words, another car hits them, runs, there's no way to identify the car because of what I just asked about. And then the driver of the car who's been hit, their insurance will not cover the repairs to their car because they only have third-party insurance, which many of the vehicles here do. So how does, justice, liability, and responsibility correlate to that increase of hit and run cases?
Thank you, Emile. Maybe a couple of these, we'll follow up in writing, because sometimes when we say things here, if you say something just wrong, it becomes a clip on the internet. But indeed, off the top of my head, we do require, I think there's even measurements for the size of the license plate. That, of course, is regulated then, if there's a sticker, etc., by the Ministry of Finance when it comes to the payment of that road tax. But indeed, visible license plates at the front and the back. What I can do is, of course, make this a point with the police to discuss, enforcement of that. I see it as well. Oftentimes, when I'm driving and then I can't even see the license plate in front of me because there's this plastic film. Sometimes they're old with the sun and everything, and they start to get a little diffuse, and it's difficult to see that license plate. So yes, I don't know that that's the only contributing factor, of course, in a hit and run, or that people who have an obscured license plate are more likely to commit a hit and run. But I will follow up to see those numbers. Maybe that would be something interesting to see if we have seen an increase in hit and run. I can provide that data from the police department. Then the question about insurance, and I was actually discussing this with the Minister of Finance, because when it comes to vehicle insurance, that ordinance is actually managed by the Minister of Finance and not the Minister of Justice. And actually there should be a type of fund that the insurance companies have to pay into, and that are meant for cases like if damage is caused by an individual who was not insured, or in the case of a hit and run where you can't determine anymore who caused that damage, etc. So I think we need to try to look into activating this, and I know that that's been a point of hers to look into. So I know it on paper it's there, but in practice I believe not. But I'm saying that as Minister of Justice, and I can't imagine that there is a fund like this. So those, at least the legal safeguards are there. And, it was similar to my, to when I started about the CFATF, when I talked about that effectiveness being an important point of the way that we're assessed, because it's not just oftentimes about having it there on paper. It's about, am I actually effective in using it? And I think that those are things where, when in terms of effectiveness, that we can make some steps and improvements as a country. So I'll follow up with you in writing with the data on those accidents, and get any information I can from the police about controls.
Thank you, Minister, and thank you, Emil. I would now like to invite Jacqueline Hoffman of the Daily Herald. You have the floor.
Thank you, Hilike. Good morning, Minister. Regarding the JVO in Aruba, what insights did you get from your one-on-one conversations with the Minister of Justice from Curaçao, Shelton Hato, about the crime fund and the many projects that are funded yearly in Curaçao from the crime fund? To the questions from the Daily Herald, you answered that on St. Martin, no projects have been funded because nobody applied for funding. But how would people or organizations know that they could apply for funding? Who is eligible for funding? How much could they ask? What is the minimum, maximum amount that would be received from from the crime fund, and how do they go about this?
So thank you, Jacqueline. Actually, funny enough, Curaçao uses their crime fund in a large way to supplement the operations of the Ministry of Justice, which is not what, of course, a little broader. So that was an interesting insight. But of course, Curaçao, I think, had a crime fund with 25 million guilders in it. So I understand that. But in terms of course, we answered these questions to Parliament as well. Part of the country packages is an amendment to the legislation and putting this policy in place when it comes to the behavior and the control of the fund, and putting a committee in place and things like that to be able to address that, because up to now, of course, it has been incidental every time. So when it comes to how can people know, what I have done as the Minister of Justice is reached out to institutions directly where I believe that they can provide something that fits into the realm of crime prevention, because that's the way that the ordinance is structured right now. It has to have a character of crime prevention. And then what we think about, and at least for me, what has been an important one that I'm really looking for projects to be able to fund maybe this year and into next year for the youth, really, because I think what better place to start with an investment than to invest in projects that in our schools. So we're in contact with the Ministry of Education. We're in contact with an instructor of martial arts and things like that to look at structured programs for some of our youth. And then of course we've been in touch with the St. Martin Youth Brigade to look at what type of projects can we do in that realm. But it's not the only realm, of course, that you could think of in terms of crime prevention. So yes, the idea is to put kind of more of a broad-based policy in place, and of course then decide, okay, how much a year do we have to spend for projects, and that then of course you can make that assessment. But all of these things are nice to say in a perfect world where we have lots of capacity to write policy, which the reality is that we really do not, especially within the Ministry of Justice. And I do have right now, I'm in many conversations, both with my partners in Aruba and Curaçao and also with the Netherlands, to look for technical assistance for how we can get help as a country when it comes to strategic policy advisors and being able to do this work. So because a lot of times we see as well within the Ministry of Justice, there's, even on a kingdom level, there's a lot of, as we say, like pots of money. The issue is that we don't have the capacity to write a plan of approach, because we simply don't have the people in-house, because everybody else is so busy with the day-to-day tasks of the Ministry of Justice. And then on top of that, we're missing the implementation capacity, because it's one thing to have a plan, but then you have to implement the plan. So we're looking at, I'm having those discussions where I also had in the Netherlands before I left, while I was there in person, and then also while I was in Aruba on one of the days that there weren't any EVO meetings, I also had a good conversation with the DG of Justice and Security from the Netherlands. And we had a lot of these conversations to see how we can be assisted in terms of technical assistance from the Netherlands or from Aruba, Curaçao, etc. So those things are coming. They're on paper. We really want to have them. But a lot of times now we're constantly having to set priorities and choose one thing over the next, because that's just the reality that we're facing.
Thank you, Minister. We now move on to the second round. Emil, you have the floor.
So, Minister, as I think in keeping regarding the YVO, there is actually a real benefit for St. Martin in terms of being often late to the game. By being late, you have the benefit of being able to see what your colleagues on other islands have done, what's worked and what hasn't worked. So you can learn from those lessons. So a couple of questions. We've spoken over the past couple of months about outdated legislation, the slow bureaucratic process. In many senses, the other islands are further ahead than St. Martin. Have you talked about copying their legislation to have a faster track here to updating our legislation regarding, for example, controls, fines, collection systems, things like that?
Yes. So actually I had those conversations with the Minister of Justice of Curaçao, because he was there for the past 3 years and now there again, and was able to draft a lot of legislation during his time. And he said he did that with consultants. But we discussed with him if those consultants would be willing to work with us, or if vice versa, we could make use of the work product of Curaçao's. And it's also a lot of the discussions that we're having within that YVO format as well, I was just before I left at, there was that No Mas No More conference to do with violence against women and children. And I spoke to that work group as well. And I said, look, if we're doing a gap analysis in all these different islands, at the same time, our systems are not that different. I think it's much more efficient and cost effective if you have a piece of legislation that's a foundation. And then from there, of course, you can apply that to the local context or make any contextual changes for that island that you want to make. But at least the bulk of the work is already there, and all the islands can piggyback off of that instead of doing separate trajectories on each island. So there was openness to look into that. And of course, I'm waiting for a follow-up from my colleague, Minister of Justice in Curaçao, to see what we can learn from them. But for example, one of the things that we were looking at, but again, it's a matter of resources and having to set priorities, was Curaçao just did a lot in terms of animal legislation when it comes to abuse against animals and things like that. There was a law that passed within Parliament there, so we requested those documents to have a look, to see, okay, can we modify this somewhat, or can we take over a large part of it? So we are looking and seeing what the other islands are doing, and then of course using these platforms to leverage getting those documents and being able to learn from that. I certainly don't believe in reinventing the wheel constantly. And one of the points that when I mentioned earlier was that the homicide rate, if you look at the data for Aruba and Curaçao, it's far, far, far lower than Saint Martin. So one of the things I asked my colleague Minister of Aruba is, what are you doing that's making it that you're so much more effective? So we are now planning within the next half year, moving up to the next YVO, to look at how we can start to maybe evaluate, because even, from the Aruba perspective, they were like, yeah, now that you mention it, we did a lot of different things in the past 15 years as a country, Aruba, speaking of Aruba. He was like, but we haven't done an evaluation of what was effective and what wasn't. And of course, so they're willing to do that and sit at the table with us and see how we can learn from them. Because if it's one thing, I think we have to be honest about the scale of Saint Martin, and that it's really difficult, especially within the Ministry of Justice, to do a lot of things on our own. And I think that we need to use these partnerships and leverage these partnerships to gain as much as we can to help the island and to learn from that.
Jacqueline, you have the floor.
Thank you. What is the status of the container cells at the prison that were donated by the Netherlands and coming from Bonaire to Saint Martin several years ago? Those were promised to the Turning Point Foundation for to create a halfway campus for people that successfully rehabbed, but that never happened. So are these container cells still going to be used?
I can look into about the Turning Point part. I wasn't aware of that, so I'll look into that and see. I know when it came to using them as container cells at the time, there were reports that it would not be the most suitable, given that they're at the top of the hill in Point Blanche, and of course our weather conditions. I think there were 220 outlets in the cells and things like that, and especially because of all the salt air that you're getting up there, that they were not really fit. And given the fact that this was after Irma, I'm not sure in what condition they would still be now in 2025. So I will look into that and see. But I think that there's some of them up there that are actually being used as storage currently. I'm not sure what happened in the discussion with Turning Point, but I'll inquire.
Okay. Thank you, Minister. We now move on to the third round. Emil, you have the floor.
Minister, so this is a question regarding the cost of prisons. This is based on statements made by your acting minister during the budget debate. In that budget debate, it was stated that the average cost per person is about 495 guilders per day, which works out to, if you do the math, about $100,000 per prisoner per year. When I benchmark this and I compare, some places like in the United States average is $120 a day versus the $275 a day. And also it was stated that the projected cost for the prison when it's completed, which will have 196 beds. But when you do the math of 495 times 365 times 196, comes out to 35 million guilders versus the projected 18. So I'm trying to, the numbers don't seem to add up. So I'm trying to get a better clarity in terms of understanding what the costs are.
I have the calculation for you here. So I think, and we had one that's just was a rough estimate based on current budgets, and it also includes the cost of that 495. Also includes MLC, and it also includes an amount that's allocated for the detainees that we have in the Netherlands. So that's an extra 3 million guilders. So we took the budget of 2025 for the prison, which is roughly 15.5 million guilders, and then all of those different costs were added to that. So if at a rate of 80 inmates, it's actually the daily cost comes out to 531 guilders. But if it's 86, which is our max capacity, then you come down to 495 approximately. But again, it's not only Point Blanche, it's Miss Lally Center, and it's also 3 million guilders that's budgeted for the detainees that we have in the Netherlands, because that's costing us a bit over €1 million a year to keep them housed over there. So that math comes into there. We had shared this as an annex with Parliament, this calculation and what it was based on, and it was just meant to be a rough calculation, wasn't perfect. The difference in the operational cost, rightfully so, for the new facility, because there was an initial calculation made by UNOPS in terms of what they think the new OPEX would be of the prison, and then looking at the full operational expenses. That they're estimating that it's about 1.5 times the current OPEX. And that was based on a calculation of that they're saying, well, it won't be double because of the way that we will construct the facility and the technology that we will use. We will gain efficiency out of that, which would require less staffing, etc. So I think off the top of my head, that initial calculation was around $11 million for the new facility. And again, that's just that rough calculation, because again, it's also what is also important, of course, in that initial, it's not just about food and staff, of course, it's also about what type of rehabilitation programs we make choices for, et cetera, because all of those are then added costs for the facility. But the rough calculation right now is between 11 to 12 million US dollars at the 196 capacity.
Okay.
But again, those are based on, as you know, with many of these calculations, based on assumptions.
But these costs are also based on, again, in the statement, you're supposed to have 48 full-time prison guards. You only have 22. Miss Lally, you're supposed to have 18. You only have 10. So you're on a much less quantity of staff than you're supposed to have. And
correct. And then, but I would say, keep in mind that we also, and I need to check if the numbers there were probably active staff, because we also, of course, have individuals who are on long-term sick leave, who are partially on sick leave, who can no longer work in the prison, but they remain on the payroll and are pushing that budget. So they're still part of that 15.5, or others that are working at other departments.
And so the second part of the question was, have you benchmarked your costs against, for example, Aruba, Bonaire, and Curaçao?
When I was in Aruba, they told me they were also around 400 guilders a day or something like that for 300 and something.
We good, Emil? Okay. Jacqueline, you have the floor.
Thank you. Minister, since 2021, when Dr. Michael Mercure retired and he left for Bonaire, there is no police doctor for the last 4 years on the island. No doctor with forensic expertise. A few years back, Dr. Nawu, who took over with Dr. Singh the practice of Dr. Mercure, he's a general physician and an ER doctor. He became the doctor for the prison. But now having inmates in Point Blanche, in the police holding cells, and in Simpson Bay, how can one doctor serve so many detainees in the prison and in Phillipsburg, and then go over the hill to Simpson Bay to see those?
Yeah.
And how does it work to not have a police doctor? Well, we have had reports of someone drowned in the lagoon, and the next day the police said there was no foul play. How would you know if there's no police doctor and there's no forensic?
Yeah. So in terms of, there's two different things here, because you have our doctor for the prison. That's one. And actually, we don't have any inmates in Simpson Bay anymore. Everyone is back at Pointe Blanche. The only people and also the same is true for the police cells. Of course, only those in voorlopige hechtenis, the initial first 10 days, would be in the police cells. So again, everything is back to the way it normally functions. So our Simpson Bay is again just a grenshospitium foreigner detention center. Then, of course, we have a nurse that's always there at the facility. The doctor isn't there all the time. It's just if the doctor gets called in to have to see a patient. So that was that question. And then there's, I think, 2 layers for the police doctor, because it's one thing to have a doctor who can announce or pronounce somebody to have passed away or the death. And that is something that we're working on indeed currently. That was, a bit of a technically that got a little messed up within the ministry. So we're working on fixing that again and having somebody there to be able, that has a contract, of course, with the police to be able to do those things. So we're actually have a discussion about that going on in the Driehoek, which is our tripartite between the public prosecutor, the chief of police, and the minister of justice. So we're working on that. And I think when it comes to autopsies, etc., I believe that we still bring somebody in from Curaçao, but I would have to double check that information.
Thank you, Minister. We now move on to the 4th and final round. Emil, you have the floor.
So, Minister, as we're looking at the cost of the prison and the cost per inmate, could you perhaps explain a little bit, because there's been quite some discussion about the ankle bracelets. So besides the overcrowding issue, besides incentivizing the inmates to behave well, so in other words, as an incentive for good behavior, how about from a cost factor? Because you're looking at right now, Aruba, I figured out, is about $80,000 per year. St. Martin looks like it's around $100,000 a year. So let's, for budget's sake, let's just say it's about $100,000 per year. What would you anticipate the annual cost if you used electronic monitoring? Would that not be a budget savings for the ministry?
Well, we tried to explain this in our responses in Parliament as well. One, we currently have no legal basis for ankle monitoring as a sentence. So it can only serve as a special condition to early release, meaning that you would still have had to sit some part of your time. So, and the only time then, so again, a condition for early release. Right now, we have a very long waiting list of people who have to go into jail. So I don't see the one as saving costs for the other, because you're going to then have 2 sets of costs. You're going to still have the cost of the prison, because we have 80 spaces and we have 300 years of sentences to execute. And on the other end, it's not just the cost of the ankle bracelet itself and the kind of subscription that we pay to the company that provides that ankle bracelet, but it's also 24/7 staff that can monitor, sit behind a screen, and see that all the conditions are being met. At the minute that a condition is no longer met, sufficient police capacity to immediately respond to that. Then on top of that as well, if there is a matter of someone having broken a condition, or violated a condition of their release, another space in the prison to put them back. And I think so I don't see the one as a cost saving versus the other, because those spaces will remain full for the foreseeable future. And I think that then we also would start to make as a country different choices when it comes to our prison system. Right now, very often when foreigners that don't have residency here commit a crime, we deport them with a laissez-passer. And while in a perfect world where there was space in the prison, we would lock them up. And so I think that we would then make different choices. When I spoke to Aruba and Curaçao, and I said, do you not just have 1 cell for me, 2 cells for me? I just 2 people, 3 people. And from both, in Bonaire right now, there are 40 Venezuelans in their prison for drug trafficking, etc. Curaçao, same thing. He's like, my Coast Guard's doing great work. They keep catching guys on international waters trying to run drugs. And so my jail is also filled with people not from here. And we don't have that luxury. So I think once we did have space, I think it's easy to look at it in isolation and say, oh, it's cheaper than incarceration. Absolutely. I would also much rather, as Minister of Justice, invest in prevention than to incarcerate. I would much rather put a lot more money into our schools, into programs, and try to give people an outlook on life. But so again, yes, on the one hand, but I think when you look at it in the totality of an entire Ministry of Justice and crime prevention, that then not a cost saving. In isolation, yes, but not in the grander scheme of things.
But based on your logic, the cost would be for two people, because one person would be on the electronic monitoring, you'd free up space, and another person would come in. And I think having 300 years of sentences waiting to be served also probably reduces the deterrent that prison sentences are supposed to be, because those people are out waiting for their time to go in. So, but still, it would be nice if you could give me a rough number of what the cost for that one inmate, an inmate who's in prison. You're saying the budget's about $100,000 a year. That's your cost. If they came out on an ankle bracelet, forget about the other person's space. What would the costs be for the
electronic monitoring?
Yes. How does it compare?
Yeah,
Correct.
we would have to do that calculation, because again, as I said, I know the cost of we have the cost of the ankle monitor itself, which is we pay $254 a month per ankle bracelet. But then again, we would have to do a calculation of how much staff would we need because again, and besides that, it's not just staff to monitor, but you would have more people out on early release, more probation services that would be necessary. The probation services are already underfunded. As part of our soft components for the expansion of the prison, one of those soft components is a strengthening and expansion of the probation services, because you can't just lock more people up, but then on the other hand, not expand the probation services. So I would need to check with them, how much more staff would you need to be able, because they're already understaffed, looking at the amount of inmates that based on the international standard. So it would be a calculation then of monitoring, probation services, any extra police capacity we would need, etc. So it's not just I could try to see if we could have some time to do that calculation. Yeah, definitely.
Thank you, Minister. Thank you, Emil. Jacqueline, you have the final question.
Thank you. Minister, from the trial against Nuto Wawu that is currently in court, it became clear that from the shootings at the airport in Curacao in 2014, there were 7 innocent bystanders that were hit by bullets. And 1 passed away since, and the others 6 are in this case for recognitions of their ordeal from 10 years ago and financial damages. There are a lot of victims in St. Martin that have waited as long or longer to get some damages paid out to them from cases where they were a victim. How do you see strengthening the position of victims on the island? And would you consider of the more than 4 million that is now in the crime fund to also use that money for victims?
Yeah. So it's funny you asked the question. The first part of your question, the way I plan to do that is by really pushing through the the Criminal Procedure Code. That's currently been in Parliament, sitting there for the past couple of years, because there's a much stronger role for the victim within the entire process in that new Wetboek van Strafvordering. So that I think is a great step, and I've had this discussion also with Victim Support Services when we explained to Ms. Richardson from the Victim Support Services what was actually in that legislation. She was ecstatic, and she was like, "Yes, let's get it passed as quickly as possible." So that's our hopefully there's the political will right now to be able to pass that piece of legislation. So that's part 1. And part 2 is actually in the amendments that we want to make to the National Ordinance for the Crime Fund. One of the points that we would like to see put in there is that a certain percentage of the crime fund is reserved for victims of crimes. So that at least for that, because right now the law does allow for the government to give a voorschot of 5,000 guilders, that would be able to come out of the crime fund, for example, or that we find a way to give the victims a more prominent role.
But the 5,000 is only when somebody is convicted to jail time. for more than a year. And for instance, in the case of an 18 or 19-year-old boy that's shot another boy dead, the mother had to wait. She wouldn't be able because he was sent to psychiatric treatment instead of prison. So then you don't get the payment, and who's going to pay the funeral then?
Yeah.
And the victims of the people have to wait 8 months for reimbursement.
Yeah.
Why is it 8 months?
Here with what for the
5,000.
Oh, I mean everything in this government is slow. I wish I had a better answer for you other than bureaucracy, but we will at least, of course, look at how to strengthen the role of the victim within the confines that we have, and we are active. It's one of the reasons that we subsidize and we support the victim support services and what we do. And actually, they themselves had taken the initiative of coming with a MOU between all the stakeholders involved in this process to see how, in advance of a new criminal procedure code, that we could still find a way to have a stronger space for victims in the entire process.
Thank you, Minister Tackling. Thank you, members of the media. This does bring us to the end of the question and answer session. Any further questions can be sent to Minister Tackling's cabinet in writing. Honorable Minister of Justice, members of the media, radio listeners, and online viewers, this brings us to the end of the live Council of Ministers press briefing for today, Wednesday, June 25th, 2025. For rebroadcast, tune into stmartingov.org, St. Martin Gov Radio 107.9 FM, Tel TV Plus Channel 15, the official Facebook page of the Government of St. Martin, and YouTube channel Government of St. Martin. For video on demand, log on to the Government of St. Martin's YouTube channel. On behalf of the Department of Communication and the Government of St. Martin, I'm Rolika Roach, and wishing you a pleasant day further.